Secretary Lehman.
Thank you, Generals. I would also like to echo my colleague's expression of great admiration for you and your predecessor, your command, and your pilots, even though they might require long runways to land.
We understand.
One of the most serious responsibilities we have, in addition to air security, is identifying the real dysfunctions in our intelligence system that contributed to the tragedy. And we had prior, as you know, to your testimony, Secretary Mineta, who indicated, despite the fact of this long litany of events and intelligence reports of the growing probability that aircraft would be used as weapons, nothing ever got to him, and nothing apparently got to you, and I assume, General Arnold, nothing got to you. This would seem to be a pretty significant failure of our system, because it exists to provide product precisely to you, the most important users tasked with defending us. So I'd like to ask, we'll provide you a copy of this, which is from the Joint Inquiry Staff Statement. If you could give us your studied assessment of what went wrong in the way you interact with, your command interacts with the intelligence community, and why the product did not get to you. These were pretty dramatic events, facts, and intelligence reports. It would be very helpful to us to have your assessment as a customer of the system to what went so seriously wrong that you were still only looking out. There is another an issue that I would ask perhaps General Arnold to address, because there's a great deal of unease and distress, I think, understandably, among many of the families that somehow those aircraft could have been shot down if people had not made mistakes. And I wonder if you would just take us through each flight, given the posture that NORAD was in at the time, which was national policy and not whatever, based on erroneous intelligence perhaps, but given that posture, and given the times that NORAD was notified of the deviation from schedule and the possibility of hijacking, could the aircraft on alert, for instance, at Otis, have intercepted? And then if you could also take us through 77 and 93 as well with the F-16s, and if you would, tell us as you take us through what the armament was on the F-15s and on the F-16s that were scrambled against 77 and 93.
Thank you, sir, and I'll try to do that to the best of my ability. And perhaps General McKinley has some data that he could shed light on, because I have been retired a little while and don't have access to the staff for some of the very specifics on that, but I will try to do my best. As you know through previous testimony from General Eberhardt to Congress, we were in the middle of a NORAD exercise at that particular time. Which means that basically our entire staff was focused on being able to do the Air Operations Center mission, which was our job to do. We had just come out of a video teleconference with the NORAD staff and with our folks at that particular time, when I was handed a note that we had a possible hijacking in Boston Center. And it had come from the Northeast Air Defense Commander, Colonel Bob Marr, who's a commander up there. And he had requested that I call him immediately. And I was upstairs in our facility, immediately went downstairs, picked up the phone, asking on the way to my staff, is this part of the exercise? Because quite honestly and frankly, we do hijacking scenarios as we go through these exercises from time to time. But I realized that it was not, this was real life. And I also remember as I went downstairs, before I even talked to him. It had been a long time since we'd had a hijacking, but that the fact that we'd reviewed the procedures of what it is that we do for a hijacking because we were in the middle of an exercise. So we were pretty well familiar with those procedures, and of course we have our own checklist that we follow. As I picked up the phone, Bob told me that Boston Center had called possible hijacking within the system. He'd put the aircraft at Otis on battle stations, wanted permission to scramble them. I told him to go ahead and scramble the airplanes and we'd get permission later. And the reason for that is that the procedure, hijacking is a law enforcement issue, as is everything that takes off from within the United States. And only law enforcement can request assistance from the military, which they did in this particular case. The route, if you follow the book, is that they go to the duty officer of the National Military Command Center, who in turn makes an inquiry to NORAD for the availability of fighters, who then gets permission from someone representing the Secretary of Defense. Once that is approved, then we scramble aircraft. We didn't wait for that. We scrambled the aircraft, told them to get airborne, and we would seek clearances later. I picked up the phone, called NORAD, whose battle staff was in place because of the exercise, talked to the deputy commander for operations. He said, I understand, and we'll call the Pentagon for those particular clearances. It was simultaneous almost with that decision that we had made that I'm looking at the TV monitor of the news network and see a smoking hole in the North Tower of what turned out to be the North Tower of the World Trade Center, wondering, what is this? And like many of us involved in that, does it have anything to do with this particular incident, which we didn't think it did because we're talking Boston Center and we're not thinking of the immediate New York metropolitan area. Shortly after that, of course, our airplanes became airborne after that. It just so happens that Colonel Duffy, who was a pilot of that first F-15, had been involved in some conversation because there was, as the telephone calls were made, he was aware that there was a hijacking in the system, and it was kind of interesting because he had concluded that indeed might have been that airplane himself and elected to hit the afterburner and to speed up his way towards New York. Excuse me. It was then, very shortly thereafter, that we saw on television the second airplane, the United 175, crash into the South Tower, and the first thing that I think most of us thought was this a rerun of the first event, and then it turned out to be the second event. We had no warning of that whatsoever. There was, from my staff, a call. In fact, that airplane was called hijacked, or possibly hijacked later on, which as General McKinley referred to as the fog of friction of war, actually caused further confusion because we were not aware that which aircraft had actually crashed into the towers. We just knew that by now we have two airplanes that have crashed into the towers. We have two airplanes that are called hijacked. Again, we are still minutes away. I think the record said 8 minutes away from New York City with F-15s that are moving very rapidly in that direction. Now we have, before I get to 77, if it were, we get a call of United Flight 93.
Well, before you go to that, I just wanted to just make clear, there was no possibility, given the lateness with which you were notified from FAA of a possible hijacking, that those airplanes in full afterburner flying supersonic could have gotten there in time to intercept either of those two flights. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. The first aircraft, of course, American 11, crashed before our interceptors were airborne. We ordered the scramble almost simultaneously. Our records show the same minute. I'm not even sure which occurred first, but it was almost simultaneous that we ordered the scramble of the aircraft and the impact into the North Tower had occurred. And so by the time even the pilot accelerating to 1.5 Mach moving pretty fast, was still 8 minutes out by the time the second aircraft had crashed into the tower. And though when the second aircraft crashed in the tower, by now, I think Secretary Mandetta said this becomes a pattern, certainly. I'd like to tell you that I was absolutely certain at that time that we were under attack, but I was not absolutely certain we were under attack at that particular time. But we knew that this pattern had to be dealt with at that particular time. And then very shortly thereafter, we got a call on the United 93 flight being a possible hijacking. And that aircraft, I don't know if you know, but it wandered around. That aircraft wandered around and flew up over the northern part of Pennsylvania and Ohio. Mixed in with this was a call about a Delta flight that was possibly hijacked. So now our focus is, we are under attack. What are we going to do in order to be in position to intercept another aircraft should it threaten someplace in the United States? That place, of course, we would not know. In the Northeast, at this particular time, we had no other aircraft available. The aircraft out of Otis had taken off. We looked at aircraft that were returning from a Michigan, they were Michigan Air National Guard aircraft, returning from the range, because at one time we thought either the Delta flight or the United 93 might pose a threat to Detroit. We tried to get airplanes airborne out of the Toledo Air National Guard at that particular time. Can you get anything airborne? Because we have this United 93 and this Delta flight, we need to intercept it and see what is going on with those particular aircraft. Syracuse, New York is Air National Guard unit. We inquired with them their ability to get airborne, and ultimately they did somewhat later at that particular time. And so in the record, you see the time when we were notified of the American Flight 77 as being a possible hijack. And I can tell you that I did not know, and I don't believe anybody in the NORAD system knew where that airplane was. We were advised that it was possibly hijacked. And we had launched, at that almost simultaneously with that, we launched the aircraft out of Langley to put them over top of Washington, D.C., not in response to American Airline 77, but really to put them in position in case United 93 were to head that way. They were the closest fighters that we had, and we started vectoring them to move towards the Washington, D.C. area.
They also go into burner?
No, sir.
Sir, they, based on their configuration, traveled at 0.98 Mach, roughly 575 knots, 660 miles per hour, about 10 nautical miles per minute.
If they had gone into burner, could they have gotten there in time to get 77?
I think if those aircraft had gotten airborne immediately, if we were operating under something other than peacetime rules where they could have turned immediately for Washington, D.C. and gone into burner, it is physically possible that they could have gotten over Washington, D.C.
Why did they head out to sea first?
Our standard, we have agreements with the FAA, and by the way, we're looking outward. This is an advantage to us. And so we have agreements for clearance. When we scramble an aircraft, there's a line that's picked up, and the FAA and everyone is on that line, and the aircraft take off, and they have a predetermined departure route. And of course, it's out over water because our mission, unlike law enforcement's mission, is to protect things coming towards the United States. And I might even add, in all of our terrorist scenarios that we run, the aircraft, if we were to intercept an aircraft, it is usually always from outside the United States coming towards us. So our peacetime procedures are, again, to deconflict with civil aviation so as to not have endanger civil aviation in any particular way.
Secretary Lehman, also, if I may add, the complexity of the air traffic over the Northeast corridor is so complex that to just launch fighters, as you know, sir, from your background, into that air traffic system can cause potential damage or mid-air collision. So we rely on the FAA to deconflict those corridors. And that is another reason why it vectored east originally.
The armament in the F-15s and the F-16s was?
The armament, as I recall, and General McKinley can correct me on that, we had full-up armament on all those aircraft with both radar and heat-seeking missiles as well as guns.
AIM-7, AIM-9.
So to continue with 77, it's fair to say if you had got a more timely notification from FAA, and particularly with regard to where it was heading, that those F-16s launched from Langley could possibly have gotten there before they hit the Pentagon?
It is certainly physically possible that they could have gotten into the area, and it's speculation as to whether we could have actually intercepted the aircraft by that time, because everything that we were doing, remember, was being relayed from the FAA.
Yeah.
We have no visibility on those aircraft, couldn't see, no radars, couldn't talk to our pilots. FAA did a marvelous job during that period of time in doing radio relays and assisting us in being able to
Now,
control
if
them.
93 had not crashed, would it not have been possible for the F-16s to have intercepted 93, and do you think they would have?
It was in our intent to intercept United Flight 93. And in fact, my own staff, we were orbiting now over Washington, D.C. By this time, and I was personally anxious to see what 93 was going to do, and our intent was to intercept it. But we decided to stay over Washington, D.C. because there was not that urgency, and if there were other aircraft coming from another quadrant, another vector, we would have been pulled off station, and we would not have been able to, there might have been an aircraft that popped up within the system closer that would have posed a larger threat to the Washington, D.C. area. So we elected to remain over D.C. until that aircraft was definitely coming towards us. And as you know, the brave men and women who took over that aircraft prevented us from making the awful decision, which the young men that were flying those aircraft would live with for the rest of their lives if they had to do that.
Now, in a short answer, why with the previous attempt of a light plane to hit the White House wasn't Andrews Air Force Base with F-16s and Marine F-18s available part of the alert? And I understand, I'd also like to have you comment on what the role of the Secret Service was in scrambling those F-16s.
You're talking about
The Andrews
airplanes.
And
It's my understanding that the Secret Service, obviously they worked with the 113th because President, Air Force One is located out at Andrews Air Force Base, so they had personal knowledge of those, of the people out there and their telephone number, and I cannot speculate whether they knew what we were doing or not, but in the urgency to get something done, they made a phone call to the 113th. I learned later, I did not know that at the time, and asked them to get anything they could airborne, and I think the quote was to protect the house.
And the 113th is the 113th Fighter Wing at Andrews, the District of Columbia Air National Guard F-16 wing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and not part of NORAD.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said that the clear delineation was you were looking outward, and to do anything inward, you had to get authorization from a law enforcement agency. And that is covered, as I understand it, by JCS Instruction 3610 on aircraft piracy. In that instruction, as I read it, which I believe is still in effect,
That's correct, sir.
you don't have any delegated authority to interdict. In fact, there's no mention of interdiction it's purely an escort function. This is still in effect. Now, presumably, you're not following it to the letter, and I would like you to speak to what the chain of command is now. Who has authority to interdict, to shoot down? Where is it delegated, and are there published rules of engagement as to what criteria apply to make that decision?
So I'd be happy to answer that, and I thank General Arnold for his comments about the actual date. I appreciate him being here today. Quite frankly, sir, since September 11, 2001, the Department of Defense, United States Air Force has put a lot of resources into what we call Operation Noble Eagle. As President Bush said, it's the second front on the war on terrorism. And as I said in my opening remarks, we've flown 30,000 sorties. In fact, overhead today, here, our Noble Eagle pilots are flying, in addition to being supplanted with ground-based air defense artillery. A lot of effort has gone into taking a look at the things that were not done right prior to prepare ourselves for the aftermath. And it is an honor for me to represent the men and women who do that. Quite frankly, our relationships began at 9/11 and the aftermath with General Arnold and our staff to work with the Federal Aviation Administration to bring in those radar facilities so that our controllers at our northeast, southeast, and western air defense sectors have visibility internally now, and that has been completed. In addition to seeing internally to the United States, we must be able to communicate to the pilots who fly our interceptor missions so that we can have clear lines of control back to our command element, General Eberhardt, in Colorado Springs.
Now, just to interrupt, on the radar visibility, are you dependent on the FAA radars, which can have very little capability in a non-transponder environment, or do you have the better air defense radars?
Sir, we try to put the best radars in effect for the mission. Most of those are FAA radars. Most of them are old radars, but they've been maintained properly, and we're actually putting Department of Defense people out to make sure those radars are calibrated for our mission. So therefore, we are using their radars. We are using air control squadrons, both active duty, guard, and reserve, to supplement those. We, in fact, use the United States Navy every chance we can because their Aegis cruisers are so capable that we link their pictures into our Air Combat Command Center at Tyndall. So we are doing the absolute best job with the resources we've been given to make sure that internal picture now is transparent to our air battle managers so that military controllers, when asked now, can pinpoint immediately an aircraft in distress, that we can find the nearest suitable fighter location, which I can say is substantial today. In open testimony, I'd not like to go into the details of the numbers of alert facilities, but it goes up and down depending on the threat, but it is internal now to the United States, which it wasn't on the 11th of September. So this capacity, this Operation Noble Eagle, which gives the military far more responsibility and latitude to do this mission now, has allowed us to be far more capable. And we have been involved in every airline incident that we have been asked to perform with the Federal Aviation Administration subsequent to 9/11, whether there be a disturbance on board, whether it be an aircraft emergency, whether it be to protect critical infrastructure, our major population centers, we are there.
To follow up on that, General Arnold, did you have authority to shoot down 93 when it was heading towards Washington, and where did you get it?
Yeah, a lot of discussion on that. Our intent on United 93, the simple answer is, to my knowledge, I did not have authority to shoot that aircraft down. We were informed after that airplane had hit the ground. That's a simple answer.
I'm sorry, could you say that again? You were informed of what after it hit the ground?
We were informed of presidential authority some 5 minutes after that aircraft had hit the ground, according to our record.
So you were given it after the fact, presidential authority to shoot it
To
down?
my knowledge.
Yeah.
Now, I can tell you that in our discussion with the NORAD staff at that particular time, that we intended to intercept that aircraft, at some point in time attempt to deviate that aircraft away from the Washington, D.C. area. There was discussion at that particular time whether or not that aircraft would be shot down. But I did not know of presidential shoot-down authority until after that aircraft had crashed.
Mm-hmm. And General McKinley, could you take us to the present and where those authorities lie now?
Yes, sir. Subsequent to 9/11, The President delegated through the Secretary of Defense, delegated to the combatant commander of NORAD, and now United States Northern Command has the authority to declare a hostile target. Our fighter interceptors will be in position to accept that hostile declaration, and the clearance authorities will be passed up to the highest authority. We've improved our communications equipment. We have secure telephones that allow us to contact immediately the powers in the chain of command. And I, as the Joint Force Air Component Commander, have delegated emergency authority in the very rare occasion where either a telephone fails or we cannot get authority, and under emergency powers can exercise that authority. So the clearances now are in place. General Eberhardt is in place in Colorado Springs, or his designated representative. We exercise this in real world, not exercise, probably between 8 and 15 times a week. So it's been well documented. Any national security event will bring together the forces, and those lines of communication are open now. Clearances are there.
Thank you. As you know, our rules of engagement are many v1, so I will take a rest and let my colleagues go at you.